This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project weekly dispatches series. More than 1 million Muslims in East Turkestan, referred to as Xinjiang by the Chinese government, are currently languishing in concentration-style camps for indefinite period, while others are formally imprisoned for charges such as reading the Quran or refusing to eat pork. Many have been tortured and killed in custody. The Chinese government, of course, claims that these are voluntary vocational training centers. Of course, there are evidence that the government has orchestrated a mass detention regime, that 1 in 6 Muslim adults and unknown number of children are believed to be held in re education camps and state orphanages with no escape. Here, Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkish Muslims are arbitrarily deprived of their liberties. To discuss the detention camps and place these camps within the larger history of oppression and occupation, joining us today is Aydin Anwar and Alison Killing. Aydin Anwar is a Uyghur American with 93 relatives missing in East Turkestan and works as the outreach manager for Justice for All Save Uyghur campaign. She is a recent graduate of Duke University in International Comparative Studies. Alison Killing is an architect and an open source investigator with a focus on geospatial analysis. Her most recent work is on Xinjiang to find and analyze the network of prison camps there. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, Aydin, I want to start with you. Could you perhaps place these detention camps in the larger history of oppression and occupation that's happening?
Sure. So one thing that I think is really important for viewers and for people new to this issue to realize is that this is an issue, this is an oppression that has actually been ongoing. And yesterday was actually the 71st anniversary of the People's Republic of China coming to power, marking basically decades long of oppression that the Uyghurs and other Turkic people of East Turkestan have been enduring. A lot of times when people know about the situation, they only know it through the lens of the camps, perhaps prisons, but that's basically it. And I think people need to know that this is the people of East Turkestan. The whole region is incredibly historically rich, and that is also something that China is trying to erase systematically and quickly as well. So basically, I mean, right now, so East Turkestan has been an independent nation. The people of East Turkestan had actually lived independently until the Manchu-Qing invasion in 1759. Basically, during this time, Uyghurs rebelled against the Qing rule. In 1863, they were able to break away and establish what was called Kashgaria under the leader Yakuplan, and now that's now known as East Turkestan. And 2 decades later, the Uyghurs were invaded again by the Qing, and this time the Uyghur homeland was formally incorporated under the Chinese Empire as Xinjiang, which oftentimes most people probably, a lot of journalists or people in the media might refer to as Xinjiang, although a lot of us people who hail from this region don't call it that because we see it as a colonial kind of acknowledgement of the region. And it also means new territory. And then during this time, the Chinese nationals overthrew the Manchu-Qing Empire, basically causing the Manchu-Qing Empire to collapse. And basically this put East Turkestan under the rule of nationalist China. That was carried out during this time. They carried out numerous rebellions, basically allowing for the establishment of the first East Turkestan Islamic Republic in 1933. And then again, this was shortly crushed by Chinese and with the help of the Soviet Union. And then in 1944, as well as when they were able to establish a second East Turkestan Republic. And this was also short-lived and lasted around 5 years before the Communist Chinese Party came to power in 1949. That's kind of the more recent history, I would say, in the last couple of centuries or the last few centuries. But before that, for thousands of years, the Turkic people really inhabited that land, and you formed this really rich, even for when it came to religion, you can see the formation and the significance of Islam and how East Turkestan was so significant was so significant historically in regards to religion. Like a lot of experts and scholars would go to this region to study how prevalent and how the conversion of these people have led to our identity and how it has shaped today. We have, so basically there were in the 8th century is when one of our prime leaders, Sultan Sukura Khan, converted to Islam, and this basically sparked the conversion of a lot of the rest of Central Asia, and really shaped, I guess, the way we are today. A lot of our culture and identity is shaped by our Islamic identity. Even if someone isn't necessarily practicing or considers themselves secular, there are a lot of things in our culture that are embedded within Islamic values. And this is, again, something that China is trying to adamantly wipe out. And so that this part of our identity is no longer existing, because, again, China sees Islam as or religion, honestly, religion at this point, as a form of power and mobilization, and a kind of a way to give dignity to our people. So once you erase that, you erase the people. So that's kind of a quick rundown. There are a lot of, obviously, points that we would love to go through, but for the sake of this presentation, where we're talking more so about current day camps, this is kind of maybe a quick rundown. But if anyone listening wants to learn more about the history, there are a lot of great books out there and great articles out there. I recently co-authored an article on Muslim matters, basically responding to a prominent Arab scholar, Habib Ali Jifri, who was basically delegitimizing what was happening. And there's a whole section on history, particularly, that can explain everything in a more concise manner that isn't necessarily a book. But if anyone wants to learn more, and also talking about the significance of Islamic history in that region. So if you guys are interested, you can easily just Google that article, Habib Ali Jifri response on Muslim matters, and it'll show up.
So we will be taking audience questions. So for everyone tuning in, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, please send in your questions. The question of, you end with a question of erasure, and then it kind of fits in with the work that Alison has been doing. Alison, you used the Baidu's mapping platform in some ways to map the existing detention camps. Can you walk us through the project, what you've done, and what this means in terms of mapping the existing detention camps?
Sure. So since late 2016, early 2017, there was already quite a large-scale prison network in that region. But since sort of late 2016 and early 2017, there's been a campaign to detain Uyghurs and Kazakhs and other Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang, East Turkestan region. With that has come this massive camp building program. So in the beginning, in sort of 2016, 2017, what was happening was that schools and hospitals, other mostly government-owned buildings like courthouses, old people's homes, places like this, were being converted into makeshift camps to hold Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. What we then found is that from 2018, there was a new building program, and that was about creating much larger facilities, creating much more permanent facilities, so built out of heavy concrete walls, guard towers, much higher security in nature than the original makeshift camps. So when I started working with Megha Rajagopalan in sort of 2018 on this issue, at that time that we started, it was believed that there were around 1,200 camps in existence, and yet only around 70 of them had been found. And at that point, the way that they had been found was through people finding tender documents or job adverts for prison guards, things like construction notices in local media, and then trying to match those documents to Google Earth imagery and trying to find and locate those camps. And around 70 had been found. It was actually really fantastic detective work, but it was clear that there was a much wider network. And it had been very, very difficult to find those for a couple of reasons. One is because that region is just so large, and that it's very difficult to monitor what's happening everywhere. But it was also very, very difficult for journalists to work there, not to mention for the people living there themselves to sort of move around and live their lives. There was a huge amount of surveillance, a lot of police, a lot of cameras. Journalists were very, very heavily monitored. The Foreign Correspondents Club in Beijing would put out a report every year talking about journalists' working conditions in China as a whole, but also in the Xinjiang, East Turkestan region. And in Xinjiang in particular, they would say that it was incredibly difficult to work, that most of the people working there had reported interference in their work and harassment. They had had, for example, police staging car crashes to stop them visiting certain areas. It was really, it was quite over the top what people were doing to try and prevent scrutiny of what was happening there. And so both because of the scale issue and because of the difficulties in working there, we felt the need to try and find other methods of investigating this issue. Mega had already been the first journalist to visit one of these camps. She'd done that through interviewing some ex-detainees and had then managed to work with them with Google Maps and locate the camp where they had been held. And then she was able to go and visit that place in Kashgar. But even that is not necessarily scalable. And so, yeah, we started looking at satellite imagery. Now, I had heard that, well, we spent about 2 months staying in touch on this issue and sort of, having the occasional conversation and thinking about it and just trying different things. We looked at sort of some machine learning and tried to see whether that might be something that could help us with this. But then I heard that actually in Baidu, there was, in the Street View version of Baidu, that there was some censorship going on, that in certain industrial areas, that industrial facilities, for example, had been like clumsily photoshopped out of the imagery. And it seemed that if that was happening with industrial areas, that it was likely that something as sensitive as prisons and camps would also be being censored in that way. And so I went to look at that. There were a small number of camps that we already knew about. And so I went and looked at those locations in Baidu to see if we could see the same sort of evidence of censorship. And actually there was no Street View imagery in those areas, but what we noticed instead was that when you went and looked at the satellite view in Baidu and you zoomed in on these areas, at a certain point this light grey blank square would appear over the location where the camp should have been. And then as you zoomed in further, the satellite imagery disappeared, this light grey tile disappeared, and you just had the normal map tiles. Now, when that happens once, you kind of think like, oh, like I've just got a slow internet connection, the map hasn't loaded properly, something like that. But actually, I zoomed out again, and because all of those tiles would then have been in the cache, it shouldn't have happened again. And I was actually able to see that it happened repeatedly. Each time I zoomed in, that this light grey square would appear. And then when I went and looked at a series of other locations, I found that the same thing was happening. At that point, we had a replicable process and something that looked like it might be able to indicate where the camps were located. And so we started to investigate further. We built some tooling that would allow us to look at all of these masked locations in Baidu, and then go and compare what was there in Google Earth. And using that technique, we've managed to locate what we think is very close to the full network of camps. We've found about 280 locations now. Each of those like compounds might have several camps and prisons and detention centers within it. We've also seen, as I already mentioned, there's also been a massive shift since 2018 to a program which is really, it's really built to last. It's permanent construction. It's much larger scale, with some of these facilities able to hold up to 30 or 40,000 people without taking into account overcrowding. 10,000 is, there's a number of camps which can hold 10,000 people at least, again, not taking into account overcrowding, and they're much more higher security, much more intimidating facilities than the earlier camps that we saw.
We have questions coming in, but Alison, I just have a quick follow-up for you. Could you give us whatever numbers you have right now? If you are to say number of camps, number of people who might be in these camps, could you just give us the numbers based on your mapping one more time?
Sure. So at the time, we published an article, a series of articles, in fact, in BuzzFeed a month ago now. At that point, we had 268 locations, which we believe are currently being in use as camps. Of those 268, some of them will contain 2, 3, or 4 camps, prisons, detention facilities. There were another 50 locations, which we believe, where we can see that security features have been removed. For example, barbed wire fencing, which was in courtyards of mostly from these earlier makeshift camps. Also, guard towers have been removed. So that's another 50. There's about 10, 10 which have been demolished and which we know are no longer in place. And then on top of that, there was another report that came out recently from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, again on the trying to locate the wider network of camps, and that adds another 10 to 15 compounds. So I think we're looking at about 280 in total. And of course, of the 50 which have been desecuritized, we think that many of those have probably closed, but of course we can't be sure.
We have a question from our audience. This is Sheraz Shaban. What legal actions can be made to acknowledge this region as an occupation? I was wondering, Aydin, you can talk about this idea of occupation and acknowledging, using the right words.
Right. This is something that kind of being an advocate for this issue for since high school for me. So I guess it's been 5-6 years. Now seeing the kind of language that's used has been actually one of the frustrating things about talking about this issue is that, oftentimes people frame us as an ethnic minority and China, one of China's Muslims. And from an outsider perspective, when you first hear that, you think, oh, these are just, it's just another population living inside China. But people, again, don't know, or even when you read on it, even if let's say an article tries to mention it, it's usually 1 or 2 lines on this colonialism that has happened. And it doesn't really get much attention or really hone in on that. And people don't understand. Because of that, people also don't understand why that region is so important for China. That region is so rich in minerals and resources, and is also a big resource for China to expand its land, even space-wise, because the population is just so huge in mainland China that they need to disperse some of these populations, but mainly because the region is just so rich. And now we have the One Belt, One Road initiative that has now gone through and spanned a lot of East Turkestan, and makes it such a key player. That is kind of, I would say, a big transition point to the rest of Central Asia and the rest of Europe and Africa and all the other places that this initiative goes through. But so that region now is now China is particularly holding tighter onto it and sees that the existence of the East Turkestani people is a threat to their ability to maintain that region. And so I think, so going to the person's question about, what legal actions can be taken. One thing that we had been doing is first using the language, right? And I think we encourage that, outsiders and people who work on this issue to also call it an occupation, really delve into the history, talk about the colonization, also realize that, in 1949, the population of Han Chinese was less than 5%, and now it's has spanned over 50%. And that number keeps increasing with Chinese governmental incentives, basically saying, hey, if you move to this region, we're going to give you free housing, we're going to give you all these benefits, a job. And basically this has also been a reason why this has led to tension between Han Chinese and also Uyghurs in the region, because a lot of the opportunities, the jobs, education-wise, all of it is being basically positioned to garner and to serve the Han Chinese settlers, essentially. And so I think kind of really getting into that is important, and also understanding that this is not just like a cultural genocide, right? Like just because they just feel like erasing us, right? What's the reason for it? It's because this region, it's not just, and first of all, now it's more than just culture. It's also physical. There's evidence of forced sterilization, organ harvesting, and all these extreme horrors that are taking place that meet the conditions of genocide. And so kind of going back to the gentleman's question, then, first of all, using this language, normalizing the language of occupation. Tibet is regularly called an occupied territory. It's actually recognized that it's an occupied territory. Why isn't, the region right above that the same? Why do we call Uyghurs ethnic minorities? Like, it's as if we've just been living there for centuries and just happen to be a population that just started to get oppressed recently because they're a quote minority, So even a lot of us actually reject the term, or like we don't like to call ourselves minorities because for the longest time we were actually the majority within our homeland, within our independent homeland. So calling us ethnic minorities really plays into the whole, Chinese narrative that we're just part of them and we just happen to, play a big part in their quote unquote diversity that they now exotify and fetishize, because they basically take a lot of our culture and they're like, oh my God, look at these beautiful people, their beautiful dances, their beautiful food. They send tourists to this region, making millions or billions of dollars in the tourist industry. But then at the same time, they're also committing a genocide, essentially. I think beyond just also normalizing the language of occupation, but also just like when we're doing advocacy work, like for me, I do advocacy work particularly geared towards the United States because I'm also American, and so this is if anything, I'm going to be targeting the own country that I'm living in, and I'm also a citizen of. But also normalizing that language. I don't call it Xinjiang, I call it East Turkestan, right? But that's also another conversation that could be had. But calling it occupied East Turkestan and really talking forth about or emphasizing the rich minerals and resources. So again, the first step in doing anything is to have it recognized as an occupied territory, and the first step in doing so is normalizing that language amongst all groups and players who are talking on this issue. And I think it shouldn't just be limited to quote unquote Uyghur activists, because oftentimes the term activist has also sometimes a negative connotation in certain, I feel like, at least for us, like I feel like the activists, sometimes they're deemed as like exaggerators, or they're just emotional, or they're they're not thinking straight. They have, they don't understand the other side of things. But to be honest, a lot of times, when activists say certain things, it ends up becoming true, or later on kind of, really taken seriously as to what they've been saying for many years. Even my dad, he had called it, for example, an occupied East Turkestan for the past 30 years. When he came to America, he was one of the lone activists here in the United States before the Uyghur diaspora increased in the States. And even other Uyghur people in our community were calling him kind of crazy for using that term. They're like, don't use that term, it's too much. And now, like, it's completely normalized in all Uyghur human rights organizations that you see existing here in the United States. So that's just an example, right? It's a slow process, but I think it's all something that we can all take upon and keep in mind when this is being discussed. But yeah, if it was called an occupation, if it was recognized as an occupied territory, that would allow us to be considered and basically be qualified to fall under certain things under international law. Under international law, if you are recognized as an occupied territory, you have the right to self-defense, for example. But right now, we're not considered that. We're just considered, again, an ethnic minority that just happens to live in Northwest China. That's the framing of our people. And even with that framing, people still don't know that we're Turkic. Like, they actually think we're Chinese. And so a lot of times when they're like, oh, like, you're one of the China's Muslims, and I'm like, I obviously respond back to them like, not really, but let me explain to you. And I go through this breakdown. But like, even a lot of us don't look Chinese, like as in, when I'm saying Chinese, I know people will argue that Chinese is a nationality, not an ethnicity, but I'm talking more so about the general appearance of mainland Chinese people, more so Han, ethnic Han. So that's just kind of a quick, I guess, a smaller answer to that person's question. It's kind of loaded as to like what exact what is the exact step-by-step process for that. But again, I'm emphasizing that, first, normalization of language is really important amongst our circles and amongst the media and amongst researchers and everyone who's doing work on this cause.
Alison, I kind of want to come back to this idea of you work on geospatiality. How does a camp or a camp infrastructure fundamentally remake a space? Can you talk to us about that?
How do you mean?
In sense that when you have, so here you talk about 268 camps. So these camps are taking up occupied spaces. There are infrastructures to maintain a certain kind of repression. So even if you look at existing camps, the studies on existing camp, whether it's Auschwitz or other camps that are proliferating, often these camps create a certain environment, right? So there's a very specific ways in which the geography of the space is remade. Can you walk us through that?
Like, what do they look like and sort of where they are? Is that what you mean?
What do they look like? The infrastructure, because these are spaces where you are holding people, right? Because for example, a prison economy in a place also fundamentally remakes the space. You're holding these spaces. There's land that's being occupied for it. There's an infrastructure that's being built around it.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the strange things that I kind of get asked about these camps is people sort of assuming that because of the atrocities that are happening there, they assume that they must be very secret. But I mean, there has been like a very real effort by the Chinese government to restrict information getting out about these camps. But even within that region and within the towns that they're built, like, people know that they are there. They're not sort of built out in remote areas, away in the desert or out in the mountains where relatively few people live. They're typically on the outskirts of towns or along sort of major infrastructure, often with a small town then nearby. And I mean, there's good reasons for that. If you're going to build a prison, you need to get all of the building materials there. You need the construction workers to be able to access it easily. You need ultimately to transport prisoners there. There will be people who work there. Those people will have families. Their children need to go to school. They need somewhere to live. And so they're typically built close to towns. You also need infrastructure such as electricity. You need water, internet. Those things, if you build out in the middle of nowhere, you're going to have to run cables and pipes tens or hundreds of kilometers. So again, you don't want to do that. And then finally, you need land. You need quite a large area of land. And for that reason, what we've been finding, and yeah, it makes total sense, is that often these camps are built in light industrial estates. And light industrial estates right on the edge of towns. The facilities themselves, they vary in the level of security that they have and how. I mean, I think, all of them are pretty awful places, but the higher security ones are definitely more intimidating. For example, they have sort of 5 or 6 meter high walls around them. There'll be there'll be sort of 1 or 2 fences, barbed wire fences on the outside, 1 or 2 barbed wire fences again on the inside. They'll have these gates which are 3 or 4 stories high. Within the camps, and then guard towers at each of the corners and after midpoints. Within the camps, there'll be sort of often quite sort of generic buildings. In another context, they might be sort of school or hospital or office buildings, but you'll see them sort of like fenced off again with barbed wire fencing. People's movements are extremely restricted. We know that there's a lot of forced labor that's going on, both in the region, but also taking place directly within the camps. So we'll often see factories built within the camp compounds, and sort of walkways, like barbed wire walkways, channels leading from specific housing or accommodation buildings to those factories.
We have another question on via email. This is from one of our listeners tuning in from Kashmir. The question is for both Alison and Aydin. The question here is, now that this incredible mapping work has been done, how can this information and knowledge be used for a larger purpose? How does someone like Alison and Aydin, are there possibilities for people like Aydin and Alison to work together to now make this information more accessible? And a direct question to you, Aydin, is, with these kind of information and mapping, how does this help push for this cause for the larger public, both in the United States and globally? So would you like to, Aydin, do you want to take it first? And then Alison can again respond about what do we do with all this information?
Sure. So I think in 2018, August of 2018 I remember that was a time when the media, I think it was the UN that kind of made a they made a statement saying there are credible reports that claim that, there are over 1 million people, particularly Uyghur people, in concentration camps or re-education camps. And that particularly was a time when I think the reason they were able to put that out there was because of the findings of using satellite imagery, the location of these camps. I feel like without that satellite imagery, it would have been much harder to substantiate the claims because Google Earth and these pictures are not going to lie to you. And so when you zoom into these facilities, like Alison Killing's findings, you see these massive areas being used as, again, what basically looks like prisons. You see the watchtower, you see the barbed wires. You see a lot of them are actually in the middle of this very deserty area, showing how far away they are from, civilization. Some of them are also just in the city, to be honest. So again, a big reason why, I feel like a big factor in enabling this mass media exposure starting in August 2018 was actually the finding of satellite imagery. And I think one particular researcher, Sean Zhang, he's I believe a law student in Canada. He actually was a key researcher in locating a lot of these camps using satellite imagery. And so a lot of the credit has been credited to him. But it's, you've seen how we've come a long way in terms of being able to substantiate these claims. And now with more and more research being done and more evidence being kind of collectively gathered, this, number one, enables us to kind of counter genocide deniers, which is now being super, super prevalent. We're seeing it on social media. People in our circles who honestly are either confused, they're doubtful, or they just outright deny everything, saying that this is all just part of US propaganda or Western propaganda. And a lot of times we would actually, before a lot of these camps got blurred out, through satellite, and now that China has blurred out a lot of it, but it's harder to kind of showcase this. But again, the fact that it's blurred out itself shows that there is something that China is trying to hide, and so that itself speaks to the oppression. But even before then, a lot of times, a lot of the way that we would respond to these people is also just showing them these images, right? Telling them themselves to go on Google Earth, type in the coordinates, and then just zooming in on themselves, seeing it for themselves, right? You would see the different facilities, the different parts of the camps, and I think that would be a big reason why people could actually see that what we're talking about is completely true. In addition to obviously thousands upon thousands of testimonies that Uyghur diaspora have been making, talking about our missing family members. Like, nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, hey, let me just lie today about like the fact that I can't contact my mom for 3 years. Like, no one's gonna go through that. Or even former camp detainees who talk about torture. There are people who deny that completely, saying that they're a good actor or good actress. I mean, nobody dreams about trying to, I feel like, just make up random torture methods. But essentially, regardless of that fact, there's a lot of hard evidence out there showing that what is happening is a true genocide. But so kind of going back to that question about, why is this so important and what can be used? I mean, again, even to this day, we're still using that data, and we're so grateful for people like Alison Killing to get their foot in the door and really really see things with their eyes and their expertise when it comes to their profession. I myself, I haven't gone to East Turkestan since 2008, so I haven't been able to get like on the ground information like in the way that Alison or other researchers have been able to get. So, you know, we rely on a lot of outsiders to, you know, be able to go in as kind of like frame themselves as, a lot of times they frame themselves as tourists or just foreigners, and are able to, I guess, conduct research. But at least for an Uighur American, that's nearly impossible. I feel like that would just put our lives in danger. But so we're grateful for that, and we're, you know, we hope that this research is just simply expanded on. And again, day to day, we are, at least for me, we're working particularly with the U.S. I mean, we're advocating particularly with the U.S. Congress to bring these issues forward. So even with the Forced Labor Act that was recently passed in the House, you know, a big, I mean, I guess, other than the fact that there's massive, I mean, they've shown evidence showing that a lot of these companies that we buy from, or we typically bought from before, were linked to certain company, or linked to certain factories back in East Turkestan. I think the satellite imagery again supports those claims, showing that a lot of these detention facilities have now turned, or they've expanded to include factories, so that these detainees can essentially become modern day slaves. That's kind of I would say, a quick answer, or a shorter answer to that person's question.
Alison, would you like to respond? Where do you see this work going next in terms of mapping?
Sure. I mean, so what I think that I think where we are now, as when compared to 2018, is we've come much further in being able to really show like the scale of the problem. Like once, or at least like in terms of like the satellite imagery and that the satellite evidence, we're now able to show a larger scale of the problem. As Aydin said, like we already had like, you know, hundreds, actually thousands of detainees that we know of who yeah, sort of there's a Xinjiang victims database that sort of keeps track of like people who have been disappeared into these camps, for example. But all of these different sorts of evidence are starting to come together to build up like a much stronger database. Like we now, a much stronger like body of evidence that supports each other. So, you know, in 2018, yeah, Sean Zhang had done that amazing work that I sort of mentioned earlier, with finding the tender documents and the job adverts that then allowed him to locate the first few camps. Adrian Zenz had then built on that and sort of managed to make an estimate that, based on the evidence that we'd seen so far, that there were probably around 1,200 camps in existence. And then the UN had sort of come out with that statement, like, we think that there were around 1 million people detained. What we can now do, like, we've moved on from like knowing where 70 camps are to being able to say, like, we think we've got pretty close to the full network. We've also got all of these detainee interviews, which we're able to like link to satellite imagery. So we've had more people on the ground who have been in these places who can say, like, yes, like, absolutely, this is a camp. It's not an army base. It's not a highly securitized school, because as some, well, yeah, it's not a highly securitized school or like a hospital or anything like that. We know it's a camp. We have like numerous people who have stayed there. What we can then, well, what we've been trying to do with our research as well is to collect the evidence in such a way that we can show chain of custody. We can show that the screenshots that we took really did come from Baidu. They were at this specific location. They were taken at this specific time. They're not something that has been photoshopped, that we have just put together. We're getting our database audited by a team in Sweden, so that could potentially be used in evidence that could be taken to court. It's there are a couple of cases which are being prepared to be brought before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. China isn't a signatory to that. It's not a member of that court, but some of the countries around where Uyghur people have been forced to return to China from, they were signatories to the court. And so there's a case in preparation at the moment to test whether the court has jurisdiction to look at this issue. So, that sort of evidence database, or the database that we have could contribute like powerfully to that evidence base. It's also like bringing it in front of national parliaments. The UK has set up a couple of tribunals. I know there's been quite a lot of work in the US. I think France is doing some work this week. But yeah, sort of bringing it in front of national parliaments and perhaps getting them to think about sanctions.
We just have a question from our audience. This is from Osama Shaban, and it says, this is more of a question. It says, what database do we have, or documents or certified papers that we can use in our own to speak to our foreign ministers or our respective parliaments in various countries to move a larger project? Can you tell us about the documentations that are publicly available now? Alison, if you can tell us about the documents available publicly that I know there are people like Aydin who are activists, but there are also others in other nations that can use this to rally their own governments.
Sure. I mean, in terms of like the overview of what's in our database, there was a series of articles that we published in BuzzFeed at the end of August. We published them on the 27th. So we published one article which gave an overview of our findings. There was one which had a series of interviews with detainees, which of course shows like the personal story, like what this means for actual people who have, and the way their lives have been upended by being detained in these camps or having their families and friends sucked into them. And then we also did a report about how we had actually done the research. We've also published the database that we used, we've published the database that we had on the 27th of August, and that's on GitHub, which means that it's available around the world, including in China. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute has also published a database in the past week, which again is available online, and you can download all of the data sets that go with it. There's also others. I mean, the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement had a database which came out, I think, end of 2019. Sean Zhang has a blog on Medium where he presents all of the evidence for certain locations being camps, the tender documents, etc., that he found. And Adrian Zenz also has a number of academic papers where he talks through the evidence that he's found.
We'll also link all of these both through our Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube threads so that those interested can look at the work done by Alison and others, and also the advocacy work done by Aydin. We're at our 42-minute mark, so I'm going to put the last question. We have more questions coming in, but we're running out of time. So I'm going to end our session by putting these questions to Aydin and Alison. Aydin, can you tell us what steps that you want our readers or viewers and supporters to do that can help and move this forward?
So I'm assuming that a lot of this audience is probably a global audience, is not particularly based in the United States. So I'll try to speak with that in mind. So I think the number one thing I always say is first, and this is the most basic, but also a no-brainer for people, but also just I still repeat it because again I think it's still something we lack, is still raising awareness. I don't think people are still talking about it enough. There are still people that I meet when I say I'm ethnically Uyghur that they have no idea what I'm talking about. And I feel it saddens me because I like even without oppression being in the question is, when somebody doesn't even know you exist as a population, that itself is like hurtful. But I was like, this is what China has aimed to do, is to erase our narrative. And China has successfully, kind of prevented, first of all, the mass, from a lot of people leaving the region, and also just it has prevented information about our population, the history, completely changing the history up. Like all these things have been very controlled by the Chinese government, and it wasn't until as a diaspora member, like I learned about the history of the region through my father, right, who was a lifetime activist. And even as an Uyghur, like if I didn't have him, I feel like if I was just, if my dad wasn't as politically active, I perhaps wouldn't really know much. So I don't blame the international community for not knowing that much. But now that this is this is something that is kind of really being talked about and people are trying to do more about. I would say really try to not just learn about what's happening now, but also really try to take the time to learn more about the history, the colonization, the significance of the culture and Islam in the region, why this region is so rich. Really, just kind of educating ourselves in all manners, and then from this information, we're then able to, I think, help with the cause. So people like me or other people are not just we're not the only ones kind of spouting or talk about history, because honestly, it gets exhausting. Constantly talking about it in every webinar or every talk or places before we had to travel to speak, like having to explain that every single time. We would do it because we had to, but now I feel like it's a time when there are enough resources out there for people to educate themselves and pass on that information. So number one is raising awareness. Number two, I would say is it also depends on, I guess, if you're, I talk to university students. I said, if you're university students, if you're involved in university as a professor and academic, one way that you can, get involved is actually getting your university involved, because here, particularly in the United States, I know American universities have such tight ties with China, or a lot of Chinese institutes that are actually controlled by the Chinese government. So a lot of, for example, Confucius institutes here in the United States, they are controlled by the Chinese government, essentially allowing the Chinese government to exercise soft power here in the United States, and also sometimes even promote a lot of their propaganda. And a lot of mainland Chinese international students really kind of really are very passionate about promoting the propaganda from the Chinese government, because a lot of times their information is also one-sided. They've been taught and learning about, they've been taught something their whole life with one side, with completely discrediting the oppressed peoples. So these are just some examples of or some comments that I'm making more so on like university dynamics, because I just actually graduated from university last year, so I guess a lot of this stuff is still fresh in my head. And now with COVID, obviously it's a little bit harder to organize things on campus and to, I guess, meet up with faculty and professors. But I think really just trying to get first of all, assessing your university's ties with China, and perhaps it's not just American universities that are tied. I'm sure there are a lot of universities out there outside of United States that are also tied. But assessing that relationship and really trying to be in touch with the administration and mobilize students to do something about it. There was actually recently a student coalition that was actually created by multiple universities. It started off with students at Yale and at UMD, but now has expanded to be this coalition basically spanning dozens of universities across the United States, where these people are, essentially doing all forms of advocacy. They're not Uyghurs themselves. They just happen to learn about the cause and want to do something about it, but really getting their universities involved and using their resources as a university student, because we get lots of resources. At least the school I went to, we got a lot of resources. And I feel like once you graduate, it's like super hard to kind of get your foot back in the door and be as involved as you were before. So I would say if you're a university student or you are involved in the university in any way, take advantage of that. But if you're not, really like basically trying to bring this issue forth with your government, and with your local, even with your local government as well. Assess to see if there's an Uyghur population there, an Uyghur diaspora, get in touch with them, ask them what you can do to help them. But even without asking them to do help, I'm sure there are also ways that people can, a lot of people self-initiate, and we appreciate that. Like, honestly, just even organizing a quick protest in front of the Chinese embassy, getting the media involved to cover that protest, basically making this issue into something that we should be talking about. I would say at our dinner table, but sometimes it's such a heavy topic that I feel like we shouldn't be talking about torture at a dinner table, but just in general, talking about like why, the general silence of the Muslim world, and particularly from, obviously, I'm referring more so to Muslim governments because of the tight ties with China, but really trying to tackle, again, your local leadership and have them prioritize this issue, have them prioritize human rights, have them prioritize, and this is not just about human rights, but also just because even people within China don't believe in the concept of human rights because they think it's democratic Western ideology that has emerged recently. So if you don't want to frame it as human rights, just frame it as a basic human issue, right? It's just these people are being killed off for XYZ reason. Does that sound right to you? And they're using, the pretext of Islamic extremism to justify it. So I think it's just getting your local governments involved. And again, one more thing is, and this is the last point before I wrap up, because I know this topic can go on for a long time if I really want to explain every single step that you can take. But I would say more recently, if for those in the United States, we need you all to call your senators and have them co-sponsor, make sure they're co-sponsoring the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So the House actually recently passed it a couple of weeks ago, but we are now waiting on the Senate to do so. And we're actually finding out that a lot of certain business groups are actually trying to prevent the passage of this act, because obviously it's going to affect their business. But essentially this act will, if passed and signed, it will prevent imports, or prevent goods made from forced labor from entering the United States. So that way, at least we as consumers won't be complicit, and these companies a lot of the American companies who are complicit can no longer get their suppliers or have their suppliers be from these modern day Uyghur slaves or other Turkic people who are in these detention camps. So that's one action that you can take. If you go to saveuyghur.org, SAVEUIGHUR.org, there is a list of things that you can do. And one of them is actually a toolbox where you can actually just literally easily write your name and where you and a little bit of information, and it will automatically call the Senate's office for you. So you don't have to pick up your phone and do your research. The research is done for you. So we've made these tools available for people, so it's easy to contact. But if you're not from the United States and you want to, take action in regards to this, bring up this issue with your local leadership. Talk about the present prevalence of Uyghur forced labor, or the prevalence of these camps. Use the research that we're talking about today with the mapping of these camps, and be like, how is this occurring in the 21st century? And so those are just some action items to take. And then also on an individual level, boycotting Chinese-made goods. Products made in China. Also look at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's report that was released. It's called Uyghurs for Sale. Essentially, it's a report that walks through the forced labor that's happened, and also lists out 83 companies that were found to be complicit in this genocide by also supplying forced labor goods. So if you look at that list of those lists of companies, we ask you to, number one, boycott those companies. Don't buy from them. I know it's hard. Sometimes these companies are cheap. I mean, it's like the products are cheap. So, obviously we'd like to save money, but also realize that this is most likely coming from the blood and tears of current day slaves. But also, if you want to do an action further than that, is also reaching out to these companies, writing to them, talking about, you can easily find their contact information online, and basically calling them out, saying, what is this happening? Like, really trying to, call them, basically have them stop what they're doing. So beyond just boycotting their one shirt that you wanted to buy, is also just reaching out to these companies. And so there's actually been campaigns to do that. I think there was one gentleman who, his name is Raphael. I'm forgetting his last name. I apologize for that. Or maybe Alison, you know who I'm talking about. I think he's somewhere in Europe, I think. But he actually was starting a whole campaign of basically having people call on certain companies, H&M, Zara, Nike, Adidas, and basically having people comment or basically tag these companies in their Instagram comments, and then having them write certain letters, and then he would provide the email address. So it's easy. So these projects have already started, but you guys can also do it on an individual level. Do your research, also use your creativity to figure out what you can do to help, because at the end of the day, I have so many people who've reached out to me saying, hey, I have this skill, and this skill. I want to do this. And I'm like, okay, go ahead. We're not, we don't have to give you a green light every time you want to do something. If you feel like this is going to target, go ahead. We need as many hands as possible. You don't always need to consult with or kind of get approval from somebody. If you have the skill and you're passionate about it, just go ahead and do it, because you'd be surprised to see how many projects that have been done out of people's passions that have now been used and been so critical to the cause.
Alison, I know we are running a little late, but I would love to hear about what next for the mapping project and ways in which we can amplify this remarkable work that you and others have done.
Cool, thanks. I mean, we're starting to just analyze the camps, look in greater detail at some of the architecture of them. We're starting to look at the forced labor issue and seeing whether we know where there are factories in these camps, and looking to where can we match, is it possible to match companies to some of these compounds? That's something that we're focusing on quite heavily now. I mean, it would be great to sort of, to help get the word out there further about this issue and about this work. I know that's something that when I've met Uyghur activists, often like something, many of whom do have like friends and family in camps and who like really suffer from that. It's a huge psychological burden, and something that people find both like slightly unbelievable and like absolutely devastating in a lot of cases is that the world just doesn't seem to know about this. And so I think there's a real need for people to sort of educate themselves, educate the people around them about the fact that this issue is happening. At the same time, I would say that it's quite a big problem to reduce people to their suffering. So it's also like about, finding that local Uyghur restaurant and like going and trying the food and like checking out the poetry and the music and things like that. So that like we are helping to sort of preserve and appreciate that culture too. And as I said earlier, we're hoping that we would be able to provide evidence to national governments, to any potential prosecutions that come up. And as part of that, it would be great if we need people to sort of be talking to their representatives about this issue as a way to sort of get that international government pressure, perhaps even get those international inspections into the region.
Alison Killing and Aydin Anwar, thank you so much for your work. As a part
Can I quickly add one thing?
Sure, we're running out.
Just as a follow-up to the last thing, it's not an additional comment, just it was bothering me that I only remember the guy's first name who was helping with the forced labor campaign. His name is Raphael Glucksmann. He's a member of the European Parliament. And so if people want to look him up or look into the campaign, they can get involved. I just wanted to throw that out there. His last name is spelled Glucksmann. He's on social media, particularly very active on Instagram. If people who are active on social media want to get involved, they can do that through there.
Aydin, thank you so much. So we're going to have all of this information listed on our social media pages and then circulated. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah.